having a wonderful day, and I hope you enjoyed the little activity that you just did in small groups, going over the passages and deciding whether or not they are or are not a story. So now what we are going to be reviewing is the story arc, which I believe you went over in French this morning already. So that's great. This will just help further develop your understanding of the story arc and its purpose. So with that being said, most stories follow the same basic pattern, and we picture it to look like the shape of an arc, hence the name story arc. So things start off normal until a problem is introduced, then the events build up until they reach the most exciting moment, and after that, everything settles back down. And remember, each of these different parts of the story arc, they all have a name. We'll go over that, but hopefully you might have an idea of what they are because it was on the quiz. So, in the early part of the story, we see the exposition. This is when we learn the important background information about the protagonist and their normal life. Think of it as exposing the audience to a little bit of the background story. And don't forget, the protagonist is the main character of a story, which was also on the quiz, I believe. So things are going along normally, but then all of a sudden, a conflict arises. This is where something happens and creates a problem for the protagonist, also known as the main character. So every story has to have some sort of conflict or problem. So that's very important. It has to have some sort of conflict or problem. And this is where it starts. Once the problem has been introduced, we get the rising action, a sequence of events that happens as a result of the conflict. These usually get more intense over time. The climax is the most exciting part of the story. It's the turning point. This often happens near the end of the story, but not right at the end. What comes next is the falling action. This is the events that happen after the climax. In a lot of stories, the falling action happens pretty quickly, but the most exciting part is already over and the writer doesn't have to bore us with any more sort of information. Finally, there's the resolution. This is where any of the loose ends are tied up and we see how things have changed as a result of the events that has happened in the story. So just going off of what we read in class, we'll just touch on one of the examples before we do some hands-on work. So in story number 3, we first learn that Jordan has always been afraid of spiders and that he and his best friend Brian were hanging around in the backyard one day. That's the exposition. It's the background information, the situation before anything really interesting happens. But then something interesting happened. They saw a spider. They saw a spider, and Brian dared Jordan to let it crawl up his leg. Now we have a conflict because Jordan is afraid of spiders and he has to decide what to do. That is the conflict for the main character. There we go. Next we have the rising action. So first, Jordan said no. Next, Brian let the spider crawl up his leg to show Jordan that it wasn't so scary. And then finally, Brian told Jordan he could borrow his skateboard for a week if Jordan would do it. Finally, Jordan let the spider crawl up his leg. So this would be the climax, the most exciting part of the story. After that, we get the falling action. Jordan realizes that having a spider crawl on his leg wasn't actually so scary. The resolution comes after this, and this is when Jordan is now less afraid of spiders after the event. Because the story is very, very short, it doesn't say directly, but the last line suggests that he will be less afraid from now on. In some stories, the resolution isn't clearly stated, but is implied by the character's thoughts or actions, just like this story. So now what we're going to be doing, we're going to go back into our small groups that we were working with at the beginning of class, and we are going to go over the other 2 stories, and we're going to go through the story arcs. So just remember stories 2, 3, and 4 were the ones that were actually stories. So since we already reviewed number 3, in your groups, you are going to go over stories 2 and 4. You will have a set of notes along with 2 story arcs, which will help you remember all of this information and go through the process. So you start with the exposition, the background information, then you'll go through the conflict, the problem created for the protagonist, all of the events that happen after this, which is the rising action, which comes to the climax. Then you will describe the falling action, so any events after the climax, and then explain what the resolution was. So quietly get into your small groups, and from there you will work on stories 2 and 4. Make sure you label which story is on which side of your paper. Clearly mark it with number 2 or number 4. You will have plenty of time in class to do this. Make sure you are all contributing. You should be able to get this done in class so you don't have to take it home for homework. Best of luck, and I look forward to see what you are coming up with.